They called us cultists, but didn't Jesus too face persecution? They said our rituals were twisted and wrong, but didn't the Romans say the same about Christ's first followers? Such was Father Elijah's logic. They hated us, he said, because we spoke the truth, and all sinners hate the truth. My mother joined Father Elijah's congregation just a few months after I was born, and I grew up in his church's compound in the Nevada desert. There were only about 30 of us, and we spent our days trying to scratch a living out of the church's barren land. At night, we collapsed exhausted into our bunks, which were set up in aluminum hangar bays. What little free time we had left was taken up with sermons, prayer, and Bible study. Only Father Elijah and a select few ever left that compound. According to Father Elijah, the evils of the world outside were too strong for the rest of us to bear. Sometimes I'd stare out over the red rocks and scrubby plants, wondering if things out there were really as bad as Father Elijah said they were. His lurid descriptions of sex maniacs, hollow-eyed drug addicts, and bloodthirsty gangsters haunted my nightmares. Did young women really dance around half naked to seduce godless men whose fortunes were made from the sweat of modern-day slaves? Did invisible demons really force people to keep their eyes locked on tiny screens that they kept in their pockets? I had no idea, but I secretly yearned to find out for myself. And I soon discovered that the only way to do that was by earning Father Elijah's favor. Looking back, I don't know where I found the energy to work in the greenhouses before dawn every day, study the Bible for hours, and then respond to Father Elijah's evening sermons with the kind of rapturous, frenzied enthusiasm that he loved. But in the end, my plan worked. Father Elijah noticed me, pointed me out as an example of virtuous youth, and invited me to join his elect, just not in the way I'd imagined. I'll never forget that night. A hot wind blew through the compound, whipping spirals of red dust through the black infinity of the new moon night sky. The cheaply built hangar bays where we slept rattled as though all the forces of hell were trying to pull them apart. The wind was so loud that we didn't hear the howling, not at first. When we finally did, we all ran outside in our night clothes, expecting to find someone wounded, maybe even dying. But what we found instead was Father Elijah. He was frothing at the mouth like a rabid animal. His eyes were wild, his clothing torn. Blood poured from his eyes, ears, and mouth as he staggered unsteadily toward us, raving about some kind of revelation. In his hands he held an enormous black scroll, capped with ornaments of pure gold. I would have expected Father Elijah to be ecstatic about finally receiving proof of God's existence. Instead, he seemed terrified, like a gambler whose bluff had just been called. Compared to his usually well-ordered sermons, his description of what had just happened was incoherent. Father Elijah had been checking the compound gates when an angel of the Lord had appeared to him, descending out of the raging winds. We were all eager to know what the angel looked like, but when we asked, Father Elijah grew even more pale and shook his head. He explained how the divine messenger had granted him the scroll he now carried. According to the angel, the ritual inscribed within would put us in direct contact with God. We, the chosen, the elect, would be the first to receive this blessing. And Father Elijah wanted to start right away. Electricity seemed present in the air during those first fateful minutes. The kind of energy that I imagine must surround soldiers right before they charge into enemy fire, or high divers just before they jump into the blue abyss waiting below. The kind of energy that whispers, drawing you seductively and inevitably forward, even when every instinct in your body tells you to run. I'm sure we were all feeling it. During the long, quiet moment before Father Elijah spoke again, I looked over my shoulder at my mother. For the first time since we'd moved to the compound, I saw doubt in her soft green eyes. Then Father Elijah lifted the scroll on high and commanded Jacob, Levi, Rebecca, and I to accompany him to the meeting hall. Everyone else was dismissed to their beds, but no one went. Instead, the congregation crowded around the outside of the meeting hall, eager to know what might happen next. We'd been uprooted from the drudgery of our daily lives to find ourselves suddenly living through the first confirmed biblical event in thousands of years. This might even be the beginning of the end times. Who could sleep at a time like this? My mother squeezed my hand worriedly as I followed Father Elijah into the meeting hall. The dust-choked wind continued to howl around the congregation outside, making them look like ragged, sand-blasted shades beneath a night sky full of insane stars. Then Father Elijah pulled the door shut and locked it with a chain. I frowned. He'd never done such a thing before. The nagging doubt in my mind was growing stronger and stronger. At first, what I'd felt most upon seeing the scroll was guilt and terror. If Father Elijah's God was real, then surely he must know how false and hollow my own faith had been. I'd mouthed the words and followed the rules, not because I really believed, but instead because I wanted to see the sinful world outside the compound. Never in my wildest dreams had I imagined anything like the enormous, otherworldly scroll that Father Elijah was unrolling. When he finished, the black papyrus stretched across the entire meeting hall. The gold-inked illustrations were clear enough. They called for the elect to be blindfolded and lowered into a pool of water surrounded by a circle of sacred letters and 6 white candles. There was a round tub that Father Elijah used for baptisms. It would have to do. We worked together to fill it, as Father Elijah painstakingly carved the symbols from the scroll into the edges of the tub. When it was finished, Jacob, Levi, Rebecca, and I exchanged a troubled glance. I realized that my mother and I weren't the only ones having doubts about the night's miraculous events. Levi, who had been with Father Elijah the longest, would be the first to have a direct experience of God. Fear and faith fought for dominance of the big man's features as we lit the candles and lowered him into the pool. The moment his blindfolded face was beneath the water, the air in the meeting hall changed. It felt thicker somehow, charged with a great and terrible energy whose focal point was the man in the pool. Levi began to shake uncontrollably and foam at the mouth, like a man in the throes of an epileptic fit. Father Elijah raised his hands in prayer, but the roar of the wind drowned out his words. The wind was inside the meeting hall now, rustling our clothes and making the candle flames flicker. The lights overhead blew out in a burst of sparks, plunging the world into darkness and silence. For a long time, no one moved. Then Jacob, who had been an army medic before joining our congregation, relit a candle and held it over the pale face of the man floating in the pool. He took Levi's pulse, frowned, and shook his head. Father Elijah's oldest and most loyal follower was dead. None of us dared to say it, but we were all wondering the same thing. What had gone wrong?
But Brother Levi's faith must not have been strong enough,
Father Elijah stammered, his usually baritone voice cracking a little.
But surely there is one among you who is fit to stand before our Lord. Who will take Brother Levi's place?
I'll go,
Rebecca volunteered. Even in the candlelight, fanaticism sparkled in her eyes. Rebecca led our prayer groups and was the most zealous about recruiting new members for the congregation. If anyone had enough faith to complete the ritual inscribed on the scroll, it was her. We lifted Levi's corpse out of the pool, relit the candles, and began the ritual again, with the same result. As Jacob and I dragged Rebecca's lifeless corpse out of the water, I realized that Father Elijah wasn't going to stop until the ritual succeeded, or until the rest of us were dead.
Jacob,
Father Elijah began.
Surely you...
To my surprise, the chiseled ex-military man held up a hand, cutting off our leader's speech. He tied a blindfold around his head and stoically lowered himself into the water. The wind picked up again, the candle flames flickered, and I watched his face contort as he struggled against whatever was happening to him down there, beneath the shuddering water. I shut my eyes until the splashing stopped. Father Elijah stood from where he'd been praying beside me and muttered something. I think it was.
Lord, grant me strength.
Then he heaved Jacob's body from the water and dragged it to the wall beside the others. Father Elijah and I were the only ones left in the candlelit meeting hall apart from the dripping, waterlogged corpses of the elect. As Father Elijah turned his intense brown eyes on me, I wondered if he'd already guessed that I'd reached the limits of my faith. There was no way I was going to willingly lay down in that deadly pool or go any further with this insane ritual. But the door was locked. I was a scrawny 15-year-old, and Father Elijah didn't have to take no for an answer. The big man could easily overpower me, blindfold me, and hurl me into the water. And as he took a step toward me, I realized that was exactly what he intended to do.
What if...
I stalled.
What if the scroll isn't a gift from God at all? You can't be serious.
Father Elijah snorted, backing me into a corner.
There is no otherworldly power on earth except that of God. Isn't there?
I snapped. A hush settled over the meeting hall.
You don't mean...
Father Elijah stammered, as a look of realization suddenly dawned on his face. Then everything happened at once. Levi, Rebecca, and Jacob were dead. I was sure of it. I had helped to lay their lifeless bodies against the wall. Yet now they were running at us out of the darkness, their faces full of terrible purpose. Rebecca held me in a vice-like grip as Levi and Jacob grabbed Father Elijah beneath his arms, tied a blindfold around his head, and lowered him into the pool.
Help! Help!
I screamed, even though I was certain that no one outside would hear me over the howling wind. Father Elijah shook violently beneath the water, then was still. He'd gone the way of all the others, but like the others, I knew that he'd be back. But when his eyes opened again, I doubted he'd be the same man. Rebecca, who'd now clamped a hand over my mouth and held my wrists firmly behind my back, no longer felt like the energetic prayer leader I'd known. It wasn't just her newfound silence and stillness. It was in the way she stood, the deadness of her eyes, everything. The body might have been Rebecca's, but I was sickeningly sure that the mind inside of it was not. To my surprise, I noticed that one of the aluminum panels that made up the meeting hall's wall was bending and buckling behind me. The door might have been locked, but someone outside had heard me, and now they were trying to break through. Levi, Rebecca, and Jacob noticed what was happening just as the flimsy construction gave way beneath a final, booted kick. My mother stood there, flanked by two of the strongest men in the congregation.
What is going on in here?
She gasped.
We heard screaming.
Everything is under control.
To my horror, I heard Father Elijah's voice booming from the flickering shadows of the meeting hall.
Levi, Rebecca, and Jacob have already experienced the glory of God for themselves. Can't you see his light in their eyes?
Sure enough, a sort of chill blue flame seemed to flicker in pupils of the three elect who had returned to life after the ritual.
This young man's faith was too weak to face the light of God voluntarily. But no matter.
Rebecca tightened her grip on me as I squirmed.
Through his light, all weakness is burned away. Bring him to the pool.
I looked at my mother, shaking my head, pleading.
Wait!
My mother held out a hand.
He's just scared. You don't have to force him. He'll walk up with me. Then we can both receive the light of God. Mom!
I hissed.
There's something you don't know.
My mother gave me an almost imperceptible nod as she took my hand. I walked willingly with her toward the pool.
Open the doors!
Father Elijah was shouting.
Let everyone in to receive God's light!
As the chains dropped off, the congregation circled around to the main doors of the meeting hall, and my mother and I saw our chance. We ran for the gap in the aluminum siding, ignoring the shouts and grasping hands, ignoring the storm that still raged outside. We ran until our feet burned with blisters and our lungs were choked with red dust. We jumped the gate and followed the dirt track toward the road, but we were blinded by the sandstorm. Even if it had been broad daylight, we couldn't have seen more than a few feet ahead. We tripped in ditches and bruised ourselves on rocks, no longer sure whether or not we were still moving toward the road. And after what I'd experienced in the church meeting hall, I was no longer at all sure whether the road, the people who built it, or the rest of the world even still existed anymore. Something was coming for us out of the storm of dust, A roaring shadow with eyes like white fire. No, not eyes. Headlights. Looking back, I still have no idea how the semi-truck driver saw us in time to stop. We'd made it to the road without realizing it. And while I'm sure he didn't understand any of our gibberish about an evil scroll and a cult in the desert, he could tell by our cut-up feet, malnourished faces, and dirt-smudged pajamas that we were in some kind of trouble. He drove us through what was left of the freak sandstorm and dropped us off in the nearest city. The authorities had been itching to raid Father Elijah's compound for decades, and our story, however insane it must have sounded, was a good enough excuse. Yet when the helicopters, SWAT teams, and tank-like vehicles arrived at that sad circle of makeshift buildings in the middle of nowhere, there was no one to arrest. The sleeping bays were empty, the greenhouses forgotten. There was no enormous black scroll, no rune-encircled pool, no mad preacher performing human sacrifices, just a meeting hall door hanging crazily from a broken hinge, squeaking in the desert wind. If my mother and I hadn't already been considered mentally unstable at that point, I'm sure we would have been charged with some kind of crime for the wild goose chase we'd given to local law enforcement. There were some half-hearted attempts to locate Father Elijah and his followers, but at the end of the day, people had a right to come and go as they chose, and the county was much happier that they were gone. My mother found work, I went to college, and we both did our best to put the past behind us. Yet, late at night, I can't help but wonder what happened to Father Elijah and his followers. A few weekends ago, I went to a friend of a friend's party in an off-campus apartment. A few of us stayed late with the host after the rest had gone home, passing around a joint, listening to music, and engaging in a faint slurry of conversation that came and went like radio static. I stayed late because late nights help to keep those disturbing thoughts of the past away. And, if I'm being honest, our host was quite attractive. It wasn't just her shaggy black hair and smoky eyeshadow. There was something else, some spark in her that I'd seen before, although I didn't realize what it was until it was too late. A little before 3 a.m., she came out of the bathroom, giggling. She'd filled the bathtub with water. She said she wanted to play a game. The others, drunk and high, played along. But not me. I recognized the symbols she'd written in lipstick around the edges of the tub. I recognized the blindfold in her hand. Before I knew what I was doing, I was staggering out into the night, my drug-addled brain too terrified to think clearly. I considered going to the police the next day, but what would I tell them? I wasn't even sure where the apartment was, and no crime had been committed. At least, none that could be proven. When I saw my fellow partygoers again, I noticed an eerie blue light in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.